If you've been trying to use the 90-90 setup to improve external rotation of your hips and you haven't made the progress you're looking for, you should probably watch the rest of this video. So when we're looking at the 90-90, we can address internal or external rotation of our hip. Internal rotation would be referring to the back leg. So for this video, we'll be going over external rotation being the front leg. When we're doing the 90-90 setup, I've said this before in a previous video about internal rotation, is that people do the 90-90 and they expect it to give them what they want. But in reality, we need to take what we want from the setup, but we need to know what to look for. When we're looking for external rotation in the 90-90, we are looking to find a stretch on our outer hip, on our outer glute. And that might take some tinkering depending on where you are with your current mobility status. If you feel your inner thigh contracting, if you feel pinching up in your groin and your hip flexor, we simply are not engaging the right line of tissue in the stretched position. One thing that might really help in finding the right stretch is using yoga blocks to kind of prop ourselves up so that we can ensure that we have an anterior pelvic tilt. So what would that look like from the side view? You'll see that I am trying to stick my butt up like this. I am extending at the lumbar spine and I'm trying to pull my butt upward as opposed to slouching down like this. If we struggle with range of motion at the hip or the pelvis, sitting up like this is going to be fairly difficult. And so having the yoga blocks here will allow you to prop yourself up to extend the lower back, which in turn will help anteriorly tilt your pelvis in a little bit more of a favorable position. Once you have yourself propped up, whether you need the yoga blocks or not, you may need to adjust your pelvic rotation and play around with how far that is rotated to the side that we are stretching. I don't want you just rotating at the spine. I want you rotating at the pelvis so that we can initiate the right lengthened portion. If you're not finding a stretch on the outside of the hip that we are trying to train, then we have to establish finding that lengthened position before we move forward with anything else. So once we find our passive stretch, we would typically sit here for 2 minutes. It's worth acknowledging that sitting all the way forward is not the objective. All too often you'll see people doing a pigeon type pose trying to stretch external rotation, but they'll have their chest all the way down here. And as a result of that, look at how flexed my spine is. My spine is incredibly rounded at the lower and the upper back. Yes, I am getting some kind of stretch on the outside of my hip, but I get a much higher quality stretch when I am in an anteriorly pelvic position and lumbar extension. I get a much higher quality stretch when I ensure those two things are in place. Once we have ourselves propped up on the yoga blocks, as I rotate the pelvis towards the leg that I am trying to stretch, I am going to slowly lean forward, but ensuring that I still have extension of the lumbar spine and anterior tilt of the pelvis. So I'll continue to lean forward until I find the end of that stretch. If I go too deep, I'm gonna feel the stretch come off of my outer hip and transfer to the inner thigh because I am exceeding the range of motion that my hip can actually handle. So we would sit in this stretch for 2 minutes, assuming all those other constraints are nailed down. After we sit here for 2 minutes, we begin our isometric contractions. What would that look like? Without losing the position you're in, it is crucial to ensure that you are at the end range of motion of whatever external rotation you can handle. And then we begin the isometrics without moving a thing. To start, you're gonna do your PAIL, your progressive angular isometric load. Your PAIL would be you trying to internally rotate your hip into the ground. So I'm driving the foot down. I'm trying to internally rotate my femur. So I'm ultimately trying to do this position. I'm trying to drive down and rotate internally without actually moving because the ground is what's blocking me. That is what's creating the isometric contraction. So I'm in my end range of external rotation and I begin driving down. You should feel the outer hip, the stretched area, now transitioning into a contraction, okay? So it's a two-step, we're step 2 right now. First, we establish our passive stretch by finding the right positioning, and our isometric contraction of driving the foot down internally rotating your femur, your upper thigh bone, and feeling the outer hip, the sensation in the outer hip, transition from a stretch to a contraction sensation. That is your PAIL, your progressive angular isometric load. We are now contracting the lengthened tissue of the outer hip in the stretched position. As I sit here, I'm going to start dialing it up the tension. Typically speaking, I tell people to sit here for about a minute or so, 45 seconds of moderate tension, just trying to ramp up how well do they feel their outer hip, and then 100% effort for 15 seconds or so of driving the foot down and really squeezing the outer hip as much as we can. And that would be followed by your rails contraction, the reverse, the regressive angular isometric load. For the rails contraction, you're going to do the reverse, where you're trying to lift the foot up while trying to externally rotate the femur, your upper thigh bone, even higher. You'll see that my foot is coming up a little bit, but my foot is not going and doing this. I'm not coming up any substantial amount of range of motion, okay? You should feel your inner thigh beginning to contract. If you feel tension in your outer hip, it's not the end of the world, but we're looking for you to feel the shortened position, which would be the inner thigh contracting. And that would be your regressive angular isometric load. So you're now isometrically contracting the shortened side of the joint, the closing side of the joint. So your PAIL is contracting the stretched portion, and your rail is contracting the shortened portion, the squeezed portion. You're going to sit here and try to drive your foot up and externally rotate deeper, and you would sit here for 30 seconds to a minute at 100% effort as hard as you can, and then you would relax. After you're done with that, it would probably be some good practice to do some axial cars, end range liftoffs, where you're just rotating your leg externally without letting the spine slack. If you have a hard time with this, you could lay on your side as such and rotate from there as a way to reinforce range of motion. So again, a couple things to keep in mind. We do not want to see slouching at the lower back or the spine. If you're in this position and you keep falling into this as your default, try to use your hands to prop yourself up. If you need yoga blocks to initiate that stretch to help prop yourself up and ensure you're in lumbar extension and anterior pelvic tilt, by all means do that. You would play around with the orientation of your pelvis and see what area gives you the best stretch. Once you find the stretch, you begin your isometrics without moving a thing. It's crucial that you do not fall out of the end range of motion. We need to be at the very end of whatever external rotation we have available to us. The PAIL would be driving down, your progressive angular isometric load, and the rail would be lifting up, your regressive angular isometric load. And that would be the isometric contractions, the positional isometrics that we apply to external rotation of our hip to create more capsule space, and how well does our hip joint actually move? How well does it articulate? And again, this is only one way that we can work on external rotation of our hip. The 90-90 setup, typically speaking, is better for internal rotation than external in my own experience, but there are plenty of people out there that would say that this gives them the quality of stimulus that they need, and if you can make use of the 90-90 setup, then by all means make use of it. If you have a hard time finding the stretch in the outer hip, then chances are the 90-90 setup might not be a good fit for you. And if that's the case, then I would encourage you to do an elevated pigeon stretch where your foot is up on like a table or a platform of some kind. That might be a little bit easier for you to find the correct tissue to engage, so that the potency and the quality of your set is a lot more productive. And I'll link you guys to that in the description of this video.